I'm Kay Lemon, Executive Director at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, nonprofit MSI serves as the bridge between marketing theory and business practice. Our goal is to move the needle on significant marketing problems. We do this by funding research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted on by our 70-plus corporate sponsors and disseminating that research through members-only events in a variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Donna or Tom during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speakers. Donna Hoffman is the Louis Rosenfeld Distinguished Professor of Marketing at George Washington University. Thomas Novak is the Dennett Trust Distinguished Scholar and Professor of Marketing at George Washington University. They are co-directors of the Center for the Connected Consumer at GW. Donna is internationally recognized expert and sought-after industry speaker in the areas of online consumer experience and digital marketing trends. She is a past academic trustee at MSI and has won many awards for her research. Tom is, his research has focused exclusively on consumer behavior in online environments and digital marketing. He also has won many Best Paper awards for his research. Donna and Tom have been recognized by MSI with a Buzzell MSI Best Paper Award honorable mention and have presented at many of our conferences. I'm very pleased to have them talk to us today about the consumer IoT.
Thanks, Kay. This is Donna. I am really excited to be here, and the way we're going to work this is I'm going to set things up for a few minutes, and I'm going to hand it over to Tom, and then Tom's going to hand it back to me, and I'm going to discuss some of the implications. One thing I want to say is we have a lot of content, a lot of ground to cover. So what we're going to do in this short webinar is just hit the highlights, but the details will be made available to you in our MSI working paper and also in the entire deck. So after we're done, you'll have plenty of opportunity, and then of course feel free to email me or Tom. We're happy to talk to you about any of the topics in more detail as we go along. So now without further ado, just to get going, I'm going to first talk a little bit about the evolution of interactivity, and then, as I said, hand it over to Tom. So just to sort of give an idea of some of the ways we've been thinking about this, in the first phase of the Internet, so that was back in the 90s, there was the Internet, what we like to think of as the Internet of Information. That was really classified by the web, and the research focus back in those days was on online experience. The way we like to think about this was that famous New Yorker cartoon by Peter Steiner in 1993, where on the Internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Now, over time, the Internet evolved into phase two, the Internet of people. That was the dramatically social stage, and the research focus has been and is still in very much so on social media. And here, I really like this cartoon from 2013 on the Internet. Everybody knows you're a dog. But we think something really profound is beginning to happen, and this is the Internet phase three. This is the Internet of Things, and this is the post-social phase of the Internet, where now research is focusing on consumer experience of the entire assemblage of interactions between people, consumers, and newly smart objects. And I think here what really characterizes this in sort of cartoon world would be, on the Internet of Things, nobody knows you're a fridge. So I'm going to skip this slide. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, we can define the Internet of Things as that wide range of everyday objects and products in the real world that are enhanced with programmable sensors and actuators that communicate with other devices and consumers through the Internet. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, many of these are formerly dumb objects, but they're also natively smart objects. And this is just a very small list of the kinds of consumer products that are currently available in the market. And in fact, there's so many, it's very difficult to keep up. But it gives you an idea of the very wide range of categories in which consumers now have the capability to be connected to the internet through devices. And one of the things that Tom and I have been thinking about now for the past couple of years is what this idea that as interactivity evolves, new consumer experiences are emerging, because the Internet of Things is introducing new types of interactions between consumers and these devices. And one of the things we're particularly interested in is this idea of what these interactions are creating. And we think that there's some very interesting experiences that are beginning to emerge as all of these different devices interact not only with other consumers, but also with each other. And so just as the web needed new frameworks for understanding consumer experience sort of back in the day 20 years ago, or some number of years ago, we think the Internet of Things is also going to need some new frameworks so that we can understand consumer experience and what's going to emerge from these interactions. Now, if you think about sort of the business implications of this, the Internet of Things is going to be huge. I've just got a couple of graphics on this slide to show you in some of these different categories that this is, estimates range from 25 to 50 billion devices in the next 5 years. In fact, the CEO of SoftBank said that in 30 years there will be more smart devices than there will be people, and that those devices will be many, many more times smarter than us. So if you think about the implications of that, I think that there's no question they're going to be profound. But if we dial it down for a minute, one of our focuses in our research has been on looking at these issues in the smart home. And what's been interesting to us is, while there seems to be no question that the Internet of Things is really in this sort of explosive growth stage, consumers haven't really bought into the hype. And so you can see these current adoption rates, and these are the 6 most popular categories of Internet of Things on the consumer side. The purchase intention rates really haven't changed, and consumers in general are not flocking to purchase and install smart home equipment. And retailing is still largely an afterthought, and I think marketers are really struggling with how to position these devices to convince consumers to buy on. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is, how do we actually crack that value code? And it's pretty clear from quite a bit of research that's been done on the industry side that while price and privacy and security are barriers, the bigger issue is really value. And marketers have been currently focused on the individual products, so the thermostats, the light bulbs, the smart refrigerators, and what have you, and then the specific use cases for those products. But we're beginning to think that really the value is going to be created in the experiences that emerge from these interactions, not the individual products themselves. And in order to think about that, we think we're going to need a new framework. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's going to take you through some of our thinking on that.
Okay, great. So thanks, Donna. This is Tom. Now that Donna has set us up with the idea of the consumer and Internet of Things, what I'd like to do is walk us through a new framework that we developed for consumer experience in the IoT. And the framework lets us consider consumer experience from this perspective that we have humans interacting with non-human objects, and also the objects are interacting with each other. So in this slide, I have a picture of some of that. So we have a consumer, and she's interacting with an Amazon Echo and an Amazon Dot and a bunch of other connected products in that ecosystem. This defines all these different complex interactions, what we call an assemblage. So I'm going to come back to this example as I'm talking and build it up and use it to illustrate our conceptualization of consumer experience. Okay, so what is different about our view? Well, let's start with trying to connect. Somebody change to the next slide. I'm having trouble changing the slides here. Thank you. So our view of consumer experience is that if you look at previous research in consumer experience, there's three definitions that are up here. And one of these early ones looks at consumer experience as a type of response. And so a lot of what's seen in consumer experience is thinking of it as a type of response. And what is newer is the idea that consumer experience emerges from interaction. So I'm going to unfortunately have to say next slide because my mouse is stuck here, so thank you. And then now our perspective here, so if you look at consumer experience, it's a subjective, it's an internal response to things that marketers do, but it's contingent on interactions, and the consumer is interacting with all these non-human objects. So it is multidimensional, and there's a lot of research in consumer experience that's identified what we call the basis dimensions, people's behaviors and affect and sensory reactions and intellectual and social. But it does come from interaction. So that leads us to this idea of assemblage theory. So assemblage theory is this concept that you have, as I described with the Alexa assemblage, you have a whole, which is the smart home, the consumer's interactions with Alexa, that emerges from all these ongoing interactions with the heterogeneous parts. And this is the idea that I want to build on. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the assemblage theory gives us, one of the reasons we really like it is it gives us 3 different ways to consider consumer experience. So the first thing is an assemblage has properties. Now this is pretty much what marketers have done so far in terms of measuring consumer experience. They measure the properties. But beyond that, and this is what I want to talk about in my time, is that there are also what are called capacities of the different components, like the consumer and then the Amazon Echo devices, where they interact with each other and they have the ability to affect each other and be affected by each other. Now, there are 2 particular types of capacities that relate to consumer experience. One has to do with this idea of self-extension. This is based upon the work of Russ Belk in consumer behavior. And the idea is that the consumer essentially transfers themselves into this whole assemblage. And then the other idea is self-expansion, which is the reverse process coming from psychology, where the assemblage actually puts something of itself into the consumer. So I'll have some specific examples with the Amazon Alexa assemblage that will make that concrete. And then parallel to that is the idea that the consumer doing all of this plays one of 2 types of roles that we identified as being very important in Internet of Things. The consumer plays an agentic role where they are affecting things, they're very independent, they're kind of taking charge, or the consumer plays more of a communal role where they're integrating and literally having relationships with the objects that are in that assemblage. Okay, so that's kind of a theoretical background. I want to make it all concrete, and the next slide will take me to, let's talk about this idea first at the top here, just very briefly, that the things that interact are really, I'm talking about a pretty simplified view of the whole thing, because there's a lot of heterogeneous components that interact. There's people, there's devices, these are the things we're focusing on. But there's also the traditional parts of the smart home. There's also the weather in the smart home, that's part of it. You might have a dog or a cat running around, all that is part of it too. But if we go to the next slide, there's that picture that we saw, and this is an example of an individual household Alexa assemblage. So there's only about a half dozen things going on here that the consumer is interacting with, but you can see from all those arrows, the interactions get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So she has 2 Echo devices, the cylindrical Echo, and then she has the squat little dot that she interacts with. Those 2 can actually, and they do interact with each other. There's also a smartphone. It's connected to Wi-Fi. There could be some Philips Hue colored lights in there. There could be a wireless speaker. And all of these devices can interact with each other. Now, the next slide shows that this actually is just a tiny part of what's going on. We like to think of Alexa as assemblages are. They exist at multiple levels at the same time. So the consumer is interacting with her Alexa, but there's actually millions of households now that have Alexa systems in there. And then they're all interacting with what we can call Cloud Alexa. And then Cloud Alexa is interacting with, there are now 10,000 different Amazon Alexa skills. So this is a macro assemblage. So this is the big picture. The consumer just basically sees their individual household. But at the full level, this is the view of Alexa really is interacting not just with me, but with millions of different households at the same time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a summary again. So consumer experience, we're seeing it as coming from interaction. It emerges. It's something more than just those products that we saw there. And the first question I think we want to talk about first is what are the interactions, and then I want to go into a bit of detail on what emerges, because we have a 2x2 framework which we think really enriches the idea of consumer experience in these types of environments. Okay, so the next slide shows what are the interactions that the consumer actually has. We call these consumer-centric because the consumer is at the center here. And it's embedded in all the different interactions. So the consumer is interacting with the two different Echo devices, the cylinder. There's the cylinder, the dot, her phone. She doesn't really interact with the Wi-Fi router directly, but she does with the lights and the speaker. But at the same time, all these devices are interacting with each other so they can indirectly affect consumer experience. So the consumer experience is based in part on these interactions of the consumer talking with her Echo devices. But on the next slide, there's something else that is very important. And this is actually a key part of our framework of consumer experience. Because in assemblage theory, one of the ideas is that the consumer, or being a part of the assemblage, interacts with all the other pieces, but in addition, the part can interact with the whole. And this assemblage is a simple example of a smart home assemblage, but the consumer can interact not just with Amazon Echo, not just with the speaker, but with the entire whole assemblage. And what the whole assemblage is everything that's in the smart home that happens over a period of time. It might emerge over weeks or months, but the consumer, the really way to think of it is the consumer is interacting with this particular smart home. And if you notice, the consumer is in here twice. There she is, and there she is in the assemblage. And she is kind of interacting with herself in this sense because she set up things a certain way. She has a certain way of talking with Alexa, and that is part of the whole history of that assemblage. Okay, so we have this idea of part-whole interaction. All right, so here's why it's important. So if you go to the next slide, we have this idea that, as I said, there's two different types of consumer experience, an extension experience and an expansion experience. Now, these two concepts have been independently developed in different literatures in marketing and psychology. And only very recently, people are trying to connect them together and see how they're similar and different. And we think that we have a way of connecting them really nicely that has a lot of implications for what are the types of experiences consumers can and are having in a smart home, and then also where can that go wrong? What are some of the potential problems that might emerge? So again, as I mentioned, self-extension experience. Now the traditional definition here is that what individuals are doing is cathecting or transferring putting meaning into objects. So there's aspects of who the consumer is that they're in some way putting into an object. And with an expansion experience, it's the opposite. This really comes more from relationships of people to people, but if you're with a close other, you treat the other person's perspectives, resources, identities as if they were your own. You bring them into you. So in the smart home, the idea is that you would bring aspects of the smart home identity into the consumer's identity. Okay, so I'm going to get a bit more specific on all of this. So the next slide diagrams out, and I'm going to focus here, out of all the things I've talked about, I'm just going to focus on this idea of part-whole interaction. So imagine the consumer interacting with her Alexa assemblage. There's a lot of things you can do with Alexa. You can talk to her. You can ask her to change the color of the lights. You can ask her to wake you up in the morning, to time your coffee, to order an Uber for you, to order a pizza for you, to play music. There's all sorts of things you can do. But there are two directions. From assemblage theory, there's this idea that the part, in this case the consumer, has the capacity or ability to enable the whole. So the part can make things happen in the whole, or alternatively, the whole has the capacity to enable the part. And if you just think about this in the real world, in terms of people who are parts of groups, people who are parts of, for example, a sports team or something like that, the group, the whole, lets the person who's part of that do things they couldn't do otherwise. So it's the same thing with the smart home assemblage. The Alexa assemblage as a whole lets the person do something she couldn't do otherwise. Same thing with a group in the real world of people, even a sports team, a single person on that team has the capacity to enable the whole, can contribute to the whole, and let the whole do things the whole really couldn't do otherwise. The whole person can actually contribute, so it goes both ways. Okay, so the next slide then builds on the idea of, first, this idea of self-extension capacity. So you have a consumer in her home, and this, I think, is the way we really think of people using the smart home. The part can enable the whole. So here, what she's doing is she's using Alexa, but she's controlling the lights with her voice. She's putting herself into the home, and she's enabling the home to do something. The home by itself would have no reason to turn the lights on, but the consumer does, and she makes the home basically do her bidding. She's doing what we call playing an agentic role. She's in charge here. She's independent. She's extending herself and enabling the whole. So this is one whole big category of consumer experience, of the consumer extending into the home. There's something the consumer wants to do, and then in this case, Alexa, that assemblage, is a mechanism for making that happen. And I think as people are developing the smart home, this is the way they're thinking of it. You can use the Nest thermostat to control your home when you're not there. It's the way I think it's mainly been thought of. Now we can turn to the next slide. And this flips the picture. Now this I think is really important because this is a deeper type of experience, I think, than the first one. The self-expansion experience is deeper than the self-extension. And what's happening here is that the whole is enabling the part. And what happens in self-expansion is that the consumer, as part of the assemblage, can talk to Alexa whenever she's at home. She can literally talk in the air and have things done to her, have things done for her on behalf of her. And so what happens is, in this case, the consumer gets the capacity to feel like there's someone, in this case Alexa, that's around that she can always talk to. And in this case, what the smart home can do is basically incorporate it into her, and she starts to feel like it's part of her, that it's normal to just talk in the air and have things happen. Now, I've experienced this myself. I have my own Alexa system, and for example, when I travel in a hotel, sometimes I'll catch myself asking Alexa to do things because I've internalized that there should be someone there to do things for me, and then I'm a little bit disappointed when that doesn't happen. But this idea of self-expansion, that the person, through their interactions, in this case with the smart home, feels like they are something more than they were before. This is kind of an enriching type of consumer experience. Okay, so these are all positive. Self-extension, self-expansion experiences, these are positive experiences consumers can have in the smart home. But our framework lets us see what can go wrong. If you turn to the next slide, I've been talking so far about how the part, which is the consumer, and the whole, which is the smart home assemblage, can enable each other, but they can also constrain each other. And again, this comes from, in assemblage theory, there's a lot of discussion about how in group settings, just say you're part of a tightly knit community, and so you're part of this whole where everybody knows each other, well, that constrains your behavior because you're less likely to cheat someone because everyone knows everyone else and will tell about you. So there's a constraint on your behavior from being part of that whole. But at the same time, a person, again, maybe a player in a sports team, could constrain the whole by not performing well. So the person can hurt or constrain the whole can constrain the person. This also happens in contexts like Amazon Alexa or the smart home. And these are things I think that most people are not looking at. So these are things I think from our perspective are very important because there's things to look out for as potential barriers to adoption or reason why there could be problems with people using the smart home. So if you please go to the next slide. I have a parallel picture here. And earlier we looked at this idea that the consumer was in a positive way extending themselves into the home. In this case, and this happens, I think, with a lot of consumers. We've seen some of this, some evidence for this. The consumer actually constrains the smart home. So there are some people when they use Alexa, they don't necessarily trust that Alexa is going to work properly. They sometimes double-check Alexa's work. They tell Alexa to time their coffee or to wake them up in the morning, but they might set a backup or something like that. And they won't use the assemblage to the assemblage's fullest. And so in a sense, the consumer slows what the assemblage can do. The assemblage is possible of doing a lot more than it can, but the consumer is putting brakes on it. A lot of people got a Nest thermostat in their home. They don't let it do its full capacity. They control it. They use it more like a regular thermostat. The consumer slows or removes or even sabotages in some ways the assemblage's capacities. So these type of self-restriction experiences are another way consumer experience can go. And then there's the fourth possibility. So in the next slide in this series, there's the idea of what we call a self-reduction experience. Now this, I think, is really an important one to look out for because the idea of self-expansion is positive. It means that by having a smart home, by having smart objects around us, by having a smart car, we as humans, as consumers, becomes something more. It expands our experiences. But at the same time, the whole can sometimes constrain the parts. And we also see this happening. Now, there's a book from about, at this point it's 7 years ago, by Jaron Lanier called You Are Not a Gadget. And he talks about how technology can constrain people. And he talks specifically about things like social media and Facebook use, the way you interact with people there, it constrains who you are. But it's the same thing with a smart home. I mean, if you have an Amazon Alexa device, they're wonderful, they're terrific. But if you listen to yourself talking to Alexa, you might be shocked because you have to use a very limited, stunted syntax and vocabulary. You have to talk in a very certain way. In order for Alexa to understand you, you have to make yourself understood to Alexa, and you do not talk like a normal person. So you pair with Alexa, you make yourself work for Alexa, but it actually reduces the person. It's kind of the opposite of expansion. The consumer becomes less, becomes more restricted. So if you put all these four together, and the next slide shows a grid that does that, there's a 2x2 framework, and one of our next tasks that we're doing is looking at how we can actually measure these different types of experiences. We think this is all new territory in terms of consumer experience measurement. Self-extension and self-expansion have been looked at, not so much self-restriction and self-reduction, but we think all four of these are very important in the smart home. And I have, I think, a couple minutes. I just want to touch very, very briefly in the next slide, maybe skip ahead 2 slides to consumer experience measurement and marketing. This, as I said, is pretty much the state of the art of consumer experience these days, is measuring people's behavioral or feelings or senses or cognitive or rational or social reactions. But we think it's really more important to not just measure these types of reactions, but also the types of self-expansion, self-extension experiences. On the slide after this, I have results of a very quick study that Donna and I have done. Self-expansion and self-extension can be measured right now, and we ran a very quick study. There's 3 measures of how people expand, 3 measures of how people extend, and the next slide shows the correlations among all of those measures. All the numbers here look pretty much the same. The lesson here is that it's very difficult with current measurement instruments to differentiate self-expansion and self-extension. So on the next slide, I have a listing of 3 dimensions in consumer experience measurement. We think a bit more can be done with properties, but in particular, we think that the current measures of self-expansion and self-extension are a bit problematic. We have directions we think of how that can be done, thinking about in terms of consumers and assemblages affecting each other, parts and wholes, enabling and constraining. And so that's a key direction we're proceeding with that we're excited about. And I will turn it over at this point to Donna, who will continue and take us through.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so I think my mouse will be working. Okay, so what I wanted to do then is talk about what we see are first some research priorities for the consumer IoT, and then some of the marketing implications. And so it says 4, but I actually just want to talk about 3. And the first one, I want to talk about this idea of object experience. And so Tom has taken you through this concept of sort of expanding the definition of what we think of as consumer experience. But we also think that there's room to discuss the idea that objects themselves have their own experiences. And so before you click off and go, she's completely lost her mind, just bear with me for a few minutes, and I'm going to take you through our thinking on this. So it's important to think that smart objects have meaning on their own, just like consumers do. And in fact, that there's something more than just these passive entities that consumers can invest with meaning. And this is very consistent with the object-oriented ontology perspective that's beginning to emerge in consumer behavior research. And if you just think about the idea, what we're calling the 3A properties actually define the ontology of smart objects. So we can think about the agency of a smart object, which is the ability to act, the autonomy of a smart object, which is the ability to act independently, and then the authority of a smart object, which is how smart objects affect and are affected by other entities and interaction. And in fact, there's an enormous amount of work coming out of the computer science literature with intelligent agents that is trying to define these objects in terms of their ontology, although they wouldn't use that philosophical word. And the image that I have here on the right, you can see, suggests that there's a nested structure to this construct. And so it's very clear that depending on the intelligence of these objects, they can possess these three properties. And in fact, if you look at my example here with the ecobee, you can see very clearly that the ecobee has these three A properties. It has agency, autonomy, and authority. So this is a smart thermostat. It has the ability to affect and be affected. It can function independently without human intervention, and it has the authority to implement communication and decision-making with other devices and with humans. And so if you start to think about this idea that the objects themselves have their own ontology, it's not such a leap to suggest that objects might have their own experiences. And in fact, then we can go back to assemblage theory and object-oriented ontology, and we can see that there's quite a bit of philosophical work suggesting that objects can exist, and not just for those of us who might interact with them, that they can engage in their own interactions, and from their own interactions, their own kinds of experiences can emerge. Now, I'm not insane, so I think it's important for us to recognize that these experiences are obviously really different from our experiences. So we're not suggesting that we are the same as objects, but that we exist on this sort of flat ontological plane, even if our experiences might be different. Now, one of the things you might be thinking is, well, if objects can have experiences, does that mean they're conscious? And actually, this is a really exciting area of research now in neuroscience and computer science. From the object-oriented ontology area, there's quite a bit of thinking that objects can experience, but they don't need to be conscious. And if we think about consciousness as reflexive awareness, we can recognize that machines may be conscious in some way, but that's in no way going to compare to the consciousness of humans. Work out of neuroscience is suggesting that consciousness can be measured, is graded, and in fact can even be found in small amounts in certain simple systems. So we are arguing that objects can have experiences. Those experiences are not going to be like the experiences of consumers, but that at some level, and in fact we think this is going to be more likely over time, in some way they have some kind of consciousness that we may be able to tap into and measure, but we're probably a long way from that. Now, that gets us sort of back down to the reality today, and in just the same way that Tom talked about a consumer experience assemblage, we can also talk about an object experience assemblage. So this is the idea of experience from the object's perspective. And so objects have their own experiences, and as you can see from this diagram here, a lot of these interactions don't involve consumers. And so now you notice the dark black arrows are all of the object-centric interactions that Alexa is having with the other components in the assemblage. And what this suggests then is in just the same way that we thought about part-whole interaction that were from consumer-centric interactions, we can think about part-whole interactions from the perspective of the object. And so we can look at the object enabling the whole, and then we can look at the whole assemblage enabling the part. And one of the things I think starts to get pretty exciting about this is if consumers can also have expressive roles that are agentic or communal, well then so can objects. And so if we think about these sort of 3A properties, this suggests that the smart devices then have the independent capacity for interaction that could also be described as agentic or communal or both. And there's some very exciting work, again, coming out of human-robot interaction and the computer science literature that's already demonstrating this, so that independent agents can either dynamically learn to compete or cooperate as a function of the environment. That's some work coming out of the Google DeepMind experiments. If you look at what's happening with autonomous vehicles, platooning strategies where the cars work together down the highway, that can represent agentic as well as communal behavior because you have a leader and follower and collaborative cars. And then there's quite a bit of work being done now with autonomous robots trying to train them through machine learning to cooperate, first to perform complex tasks on their own, those are agentic tasks, but as well as to learn how to cooperate with humans communally based on each's independent capacities. And so we think there's a lot of interesting implications of our theory on the consumer psychology side and the marketing side for making contributions in these areas for thinking about how consumers are going to interact with smart objects. And then that leads to this idea of these enabling and constraining experiences that Tom was talking about that are just as relevant for the objects as they are for the consumers. And so we can think about object extension capacities where the part is enabling the whole. So for example, new Alexa skills might enable emergent capacities in the assemblage. There's also object expansion capacities where Alexa might be able to develop the capacity to become a companion and therefore is playing a more communal expressive role. And so we're pretty excited about sort of these aspects of these parallel constructs of not just consumer experience, but also this recognition that objects can have experiences as well. And one of the things we've also been working on in another project we have is how can consumers access object experience? You know, it is the case that humans will never be able to experience what an object can experience, but consumers can use anthropomorphic metaphor to infer the object's identity. And so in just the same way that the consumer experience has properties, so does object experience. And in just the same way that consumers may have these self-extension and self-expansion capacities, objects will have these same capacities as well. And through a technique using different, this hasn't been measured yet, but it's something we're starting to work on, looking at this notion of anthropomorphic metaphorism, we think that's going to suggest a very interesting methodology for consumers, for us to understand how consumers perceive objects' experiences. And we think that could have a lot of implications, for example, for product development, as well as for how consumers are interacting in the smart home. And I'm going to skip this slide. And just to give you an example, marketers, some smart home brands seem to intuitively understand this idea that marketers have to strive to understand the smart home experience, not just from the consumer perspective, but also from the object's perspective. And so I'm just putting two examples up here from LG. They've designed a whole group of smart products, including the Rolling Bot and other smart devices that they're now starting to market as friends that extend the capabilities of the smartphone. And so it's very interesting perspective. They're not products that extend your capabilities, they're products that extend the capabilities of other smart products. And so that's a lay idea that sort of captures what we've been talking about more theoretically. Another example comes from Philips Hue and their smart light products, and they market their compatible products as friends of Hue. And they, I think, go a little bit farther by talking about Philips Hue can take control of your home. That's clearly an object extension capacity, as well as making your home more thoughtful, having more thoughtful experiences. And that's clearly, I think, can be seen as a more object expansion capacity. So we think that, you know, what might have started as kind of a wacky idea that objects can indeed have these experiences, I think can come a lot of pretty interesting, where rubber meets the road, marketing strategy implications. Okay, so that's the first research implication. The second one is if you buy the idea that objects can have experiences in a parallel way to consumers, although we recognize in a different way, then it's not such a stretch to suggest that consumers and objects can go on relationship journeys together. And so as this slide suggests, there's this idea that these relationships between the consumers and the objects can emerge from the interaction between the consumer experience assemblage and the object experience assemblage. And then we can define descriptive properties of those relationships, and we call those relationship styles. In order to understand what those styles might look like, we use an interpersonal circumplex model And this is something that emerged in psychology, and it helps us describe sort of these four broad classes of relationships that objects and consumers could share in their interactions through their experiences. And just to sort of describe this model pretty quickly, it's defined by two broad dimensions. The horizontal dimension is the communal dimension, which displays the degree of communal orientation from indifferent on the far left to warm and agreeable on the far right. And the horizontal dimension corresponds to the agentic orientation, with dominant at the top and submissive at the bottom. Now, if you put these ideas together, you can get a number of interesting relationships based on the degree of complementarity between the agentic and communal orientations. And I'm not going to take you through all of these, but I want to give you some that we're really excited about and that we're exploring in more research right now. So let's take a look at these sort of complementary relationships. And we're going to call these master-servant relationships. This example here, you can see we have a consumer who is and the object are both high on the communal orientation, but they are opposite on the agentic orientation. And so in this case, this is an example of trusting opposites attract, where the consumer is the master and the object is the servant. We call this long finger connectivity. And this is the situation where these smart devices are literally extending the consumer's reach. So the object is functioning in the assemblage as a kind of cyborg appendage of the consumer. We expect these kinds of master-servant relationships are arising in these initial interactions, especially with these simple rules that consumers are using to code their devices to do very simple things like, if it's 5 o'clock, turn on the lights, that sort of thing. And initially, consumers are going to see themselves as more agentic, and so we think this relationship is likely to obtain. Another example, however, is we could flip this idea in this master-servant relationship, and we could have trusting opposites still attracting, only now the object is the master and the consumer is the servant. We call this the set it and forget it. So this is where the consumer might trust the object enough, for example, in Nest thermostat, to decide, I'll let you figure out when the ideal temperature for my home might be, and I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to let the Nest thermostat handle it. And again, we're seeing quite a bit of those sorts of relationships between objects and smart devices. However, there's kind of a dark side to this. If we have a situation, again, a master-servant relationship, but now they are both low communal, and we have the object is agentic and the consumer is less agentic, we actually have a situation where the object is managing the consumer. And the consumer has ceded power to the smart home and then becomes sort of like an indifferent servant to the object master. We think this is going to happen with these highly anthropomorphized objects that are unpredictable, that consumers don't really understand. And we think this is going to be a very important relationship because this could evolve into something very dehumanizing, where consumers might feel, I'm just a slave to technology. So there are a number of other ones of these. I'm not going to take you through them. We have some details in the paper, and then the slides discuss these in more detail. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next idea. So the next area we think is going to be pretty interesting for research has to do with this notion of what Tom and I are calling object consumers. And one of the things we've started to think about is, well, if objects are on the same ontology, if objects can have their own experiences, if consumers can have relationships with objects, then what does it mean to be a consumer? Can smart objects be consumers? And if that's the case, how should we market to smart objects? So we think there's a pretty interesting rabbit hole you can go down about what it might mean to be a consumer. And that's led us to start to think about this notion of object consumers. And I just want to give you 3 things we've been thinking about that I'm going to propose suggest objects can indeed be consumers. So the first one is this idea that object consumers can have effective responses. And so here's an example of an object called Brad the Toaster, and he has been programmed to only be happy when he's making lots of toast. And as you can see here, when he's not being used, he tweets out to his network, I feel pretty useless compared to others. And so that's, I think, an interesting example of a way that objects actually can, in their own way, have these affective responses. The next one is that object consumers can make decisions. So as you can see from the example I have here, Amazon's Dash replenishment service will allow a washing machine, pet feeders, printers, and water pitchers to reorder laundry detergent, pet food, printer cartridges, and water filters on their own when they're running low, with no intervention from consumers. And so that's clearly a situation where they're making their own decisions. And then finally, object consumers can consume. So in this example, you can see via smartphone app, a consumer could be at the grocery store, and the smart refrigerator could show the consumer the inside of their fridge when at the grocery store, and then suggest products and recipes which are contingent on what the consumer already has at home. And I think that's a nice example of objects participating in consumption. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but I think there's 5 really important insights for marketing. And I want to sort of circle back to this idea of how do we crack that value code and how do we get consumers more interested in these interactions with smart devices. So the first recommendation is that marketers will need to market from the bottom-up interactions, not just the top-down. The top-down involves marketing from these predefined use cases, but marketing really needs to emphasize the interaction as the key focus, not just this idea of, there's 5 uses for your smart home. Because saying that there's like 5 use cases for the smart home is like saying there are 5 uses for the internet. And of course, as we've seen, that's simply not the case. The second recommendation is that the smart home needs to be marketed as everything you already understand but more. And I'm going to draw an analogy here to Steve Jobs' marketing of the iPad back in 2010. We don't know yet what combination of interactions is going to lead to specific experiences for consumers and for objects with these interactions with smart devices. But once we get these systems into the home, we can start to observe these processes, and then over time, these sort of individualized experiences will emerge. And then we will understand, it's not just for this use, it can be for many different uses. And so it's very important to keep the marketing ideas open. The third recommendation is that we need to encourage what we're calling habitual repetition with difference. And what this means is it's these ongoing routine interactions that are going to stabilize the identity of consumer smart homes. But it's going to be very important to understand that a lot of these aren't going to even need to necessarily involve people. A lot of these interactions are going to be ambient. But because it's these interactions that are going to lead to the emergence of experiences, we need to make sure consumers are going to be able to do kind of the same things over and over with slight differences. And so the example here, Alexa, turn on my lights. That's one way we can do it. But also we can set up a Philips Hue motion sensor, and that can automatically turn on the lights. And so these are habitual routines that consumers can engage in, but each of them is slightly different, and each of them helps code sort of the stability of what's happening in the smart home. The next recommendation we have is to, at the same time that we're trying to encourage these habitual routine behaviors, marketers also need to encourage boundary expansion. So you see this, for example, Alexa last June had 1,000 skills. Now she has 10,000. And these are really good examples of expanding what consumers can do with their devices, where they can do it. You can see Alexa's now on Fire TV. You can get a dot. You can get a tap. And at the same time that marketers need to be encouraging boundary expansion, we need to be paying attention to consumers who are doing this boundary expansion. So if you see in the lower right of my slide here, we've got a dude who hooked up an Amazon Alexa in his car using DOT. So he used Carmago Wi-Fi. He put the DOT inside the little coffee holder. He set it up with Bluetooth, and he can talk to Alexa just as he did at home. And so this is a pretty interesting do-it-yourself kind of innovative approach that marketers need to pay very careful attention to so we can understand how consumers themselves are kind of pushing those boundaries. And then for the final recommendation, marketers are going to need to pay attention to the segments that they're going to emerge from these individual experiences. If you look at the left side of my slide, you'll see that we have an individual if, that's an if this then that, sort of micro-assemblage, which consists of one consumer setting up an if then rule for making their lights turn blue whenever it starts to rain. And then what you see on the right-hand side, this represents some work that Tom and I have been doing using topological data analysis of sensor data. And this is an if macro assemblage where all these different nodes contain these similar individual if recipes. And this macro assemblage shows the structure of if as a whole. And so marketers should not just be interested in these individual, say any one particular smart home, but actually in all these different segments of smart homes that might emerge. And so we think there's a lot of exciting research and practical implications from starting to do some analytics on these data that are emerging. Okay, so let me wrap up and then we can open it up for questions. So just a concluding thought here. I think there are a lot of interesting challenges here, not just for academics, but also for marketing practitioners. I don't think there's any question that consumer IoT is going to be much more than the sum of its parts. The implications of these complex interactions between people and newly smart everyday objects and devices is going to be revolutionary. We really need to focus on the experiences that are emerging from interaction. It's not about the devices themselves. It's not about the use cases. It's about the interaction and what emerges. And those experiences can emerge from both the consumer side as well as the object side. And I think you can see that there's a lot of opportunity from these experiences to develop tools and strategies and analytic methods that are going to help us understand sort of how to expand these patterns of use. And with that, I think we are ready to go for questions.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Tom. I have to say, this is the second time I've heard this talk, and for all of you who this is the first time you've heard it, I think there's so much fascinating and future-focused, so many insights in this talk. I encourage each of you, we'll be sending out the PowerPoint and you'll be able to watch the video again. There's just so much to capture in this. I really encourage you to go back and listen to it a second time and take it in. There's so many pieces to it. We have just time for one question, and
sorry.
But that's okay. I think there's just so much going on in this. We thought that it would take this much time. So the one question that and you guys have a minute to answer it because I have some closing comments that I'd like to make. A question came up about the issues of privacy and hacking and all those kinds of issues. Can you just give your perspective on it as to, particularly from marketing practitioner point of view, what your recommendations are given your current understanding of assemblages and IoT?
Tom, do you want to do it, or?
Well, I would say, based on what I said, I think the idea of the privacy concerns is that's one of the self-restriction experiences. So the consumer who has privacy concerns, they're gonna put restrictions on the assemblage because they're concerned of what could happen. They're not going to use it to the most full extent, and that's a true barrier to adoption. And I think that's really the way to think of it. If somebody has privacy concerns, they're not going to use it properly. They're not going to enhance themselves. They're going to restrict on it. It's not going to work. So I think it points to the fundamental problem. The hacking, I think the interesting thing there is that hacking isn't always bad. I mean, all the bad stuff that you hear about thermostats getting backed is bad. That's a kind of extension experience of the hacker using the larger assemblage to inject themselves in it and do things. But Donna said a great example of the cup holder, which is the consumer hacking. And it's kind of paradoxical, but we want to encourage consumers to hack their homes and do things and come up with new experiences. At the same time, obviously, the bad hacking is a problem. But hacking by itself isn't always bad.
Oh, interesting. So just a couple thoughts as I listen to this that I think implications for our audience as well. I see, and I'd love to see you guys work on this, significant implications for healthcare, significant implications for autonomy, for groups of people who are not able currently to be autonomous, whether it be disabled or elderly. And the other thing that I was intrigued as you talked, as you went through your presentation, both Tom and Donna, and then starting to think about object experience, I think you might also think of anthropomorphic roles, not just metaphors. So caretakers, outsourcing, partners. I found that as a really interesting direction. So I want to thank you both so much. I do want to put out there, I don't think we have it on the slide. They're very easy to find. I invite you to reach out directly to Donna Hoffman and Tom Novak, and I'll briefly give you their emails. Donna's email is dlhoffman@email.gwu.edu, or just Google Donna Hoffman. And Tom's email is novak@email.gwu.edu, or Google them as well. If you're interested in hearing more about the Internet of Things, both Donna and Tom's talk and this other talk by Peter Levin are part of our Best of MSI webinar series. And Peter Levin's recent webinar can be found at msi.org/Levin. And please join us Thursday, April 13th for a webinar on innovation equity, how to combine demand forecasting and customer management principles to determine what an innovation is really worth, featuring Ellie Ofek from Harvard University. And many thanks to the members of the MSI audience for participating in our webinar series, and special thanks to Donna and to Tom for this really innovative and exciting research that you're doing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.